Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. This evening we have a Sangha panel discussion on the topic of compassion. So we can start by paying homage to the Buddha, and then we'll present some thoughts. The three of us will say a few words on this topic, and then we'll take any questions that you might have. So we'll start with paying homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddham dhammang sanghang namassami. So this evening the topic is compassion, and as this topic was selected by Ayasama, maybe if you'd like to get us started with a few words on this topic, and then we'll take it from there.
Right. Well, thank you, Bhante. Well, I might have picked the topic, but it wasn't necessarily for me to speak about it. But yeah, when we talk about compassion, a lot of times we bring a big baggage, actually, of what our idea of compassion is with us. And very often than not, at least definitely was in my case, when I encountered Buddhist practice, the idea of compassion was very much loaded with the meanings that usually were conveyed in the culture that I come from, so Italian culture. And so the references were very much taken within Italian Catholicism. And as Bhante Sudaso has recently seen, since we were traveling in Italy, there's many representations of religious representations everywhere throughout the country. And there's many representations of compassion. Mother Mary actually being the representation, one of the major representation of infinite compassion. And well, I have to say that Mother Mary is actually usually quite an uplifting, imagery, usually very similar to Guanyin Bodhisattva. But Jesus, on the other hand, very uplifting. I don't want to say that Jesus isn't, but he's always also a representation of compassion. But on the other hand, together with all the saints, but the representation, the iconography is actually quite intense, quite brutal, I would say. Usually it's quite the opposite of the representation of the Buddha that we see here. That is very peaceful and calm. Usually there's a lot of blood, actually, a lot of suffering present in the iconography. All the saints usually have gone through a lot of martyrdom out of compassion for many people. So you'll have also all the different relics in not in all the churches, but in most churches in Italy, there's always relics of different saints and different people that have essentially given their lives for the sake of others. So when we talk about compassion, compatire actually is the Italian name, and it comes from precisely patire, pathos, and cum in the prefix cum in Latin, which means basically to have this pathos together, to have this passion together, to share it with one another. But usually how I was perceiving this term was very much in terms of very much embedded with the sense of sacrifice that pretty much every single person, definitely if you're a parent, you're supposed to have big sense of sacrifice, right? And sacrifice yourself for the benefit of others. And I remember when I came to Buddhist practice, and actually Bhante Sudazo was one of the teachers that was giving some Dhamma thoughts on, was explaining actually the practice of metta. I remember at Bhavana Society, where I also had met Bhante Jay. I remember one of the directions that he gave in the practice of metta was to wish for everybody to be happy, including ourselves. I remember when I heard including ourselves, I started crying actually. Like literally, literally crying. Up until then, it had never occurred to me that in any kind of altruistic practice, in any kind of practice that was, that had, a name like loving kindness or passion or compassion and so forth, that I was included in the picture. I kind of had missed one person in the whole group, and I kind of had a flashback of all my life. And, I was definitely not a saint, not one of the martyrs that you see in Italy. In fact, I'm still alive. And there's no relics anywhere. But yeah, it was, I think in that moment, something really hit home. And I was like, oh, wow, that's maybe why I'm still so unhappy. That's why there's so much suffering also, like in my mind. I was missing this person all along in all these years. So my favorite understanding of compassion is actually the translation not of karuna but of anukampa that I've shared multiple times, which is literally trembling together, it means. And which is kind of actually similar to the Latin root of compatire, so like having this sort of pathos, this suffering and sharing it together. But I quite very much like the connotation of trembling. So we're not necessarily sharing. Sharing is carrying the suffering, but rather we have an understanding. It comes very much tied up with wisdom, that innate understanding that we're all in this basically sinking ship together. We're all suffering together, and it's part of this human existential condition that we have. And so without having a sense of superiority towards the suffering of others, and neither having a sense of inferiority towards others, but rather kind of understanding that what this suffering is all about, and trying to help where we can help both others and ourselves, and understanding that the Buddha gives us a really incredible path to get out of suffering, so that this suffering doesn't have to be, marking and keeping us, stuck in this really kind of sad state of existence, but actually that we can eliminate it, and first alleviate it, obviously, for ourselves and others, and also eliminate it then also for ourselves. And whenever we do something for ourselves, we do it for others, and whenever we do it for others, we do it for ourselves. And maybe here there's a beautiful simile of the acrobat that maybe one of the venerables would like to share. And I'll pass it on, since I've been talking for a long time.
Yeah, well, I mean, the simile of the acrobats is actually one of the classic examples of this. The Buddha tells a story of two acrobats who are about to do a performance, and one of them says, well, you look after me and I'll look after you, and in this way we'll both be safe. We'll do our performance, we'll end it safely, and we'll get well paid for it. And the other one says, no, that's not correct. That's not correct. You look after yourself and I'll look after myself, and in this way we'll both be safe, and we'll both complete our performance and get paid for it. And then at the end of the sutta, then the Buddha says, when one looks after oneself, one looks after others. When one looks after others, one looks after oneself. In other words, emphasizing that the practice of wishing for beings to be free of suffering it's automatically inclusive of both. And that when we work to develop and train our own mind, then that increases our capacity to be of benefit to others. And also when we actively try to be of benefit to others, that also brings benefit to ourselves. And again, just emphasizing that compassion is not self-sacrifice. The Buddha says in countless places in the suttas that we should not do something if it causes harm to ourselves, or if it causes harm to others, or if it causes harm to both. So our first priority then is always making sure that we're not harming ourselves, and that we're bringing benefit to ourselves. We're benefiting our development of wholesome mind states. And then based upon that, we have the capacity to, with a clear mind, a peaceful mind, we can see how our choices affect the people around us, and choose courses of action which cause the least amount of harm and bring the most benefit to those around us. And I also want to emphasize, again, that the core motivation for Buddhist practice is fundamentally compassion. So even if one is practicing with a strict perspective of, well, I just want to get myself out of samsara as quickly as possible, even if that's the attitude that one has, well, then that's still compassion, because you want at least one person to be free of suffering. That's a great place to start. Actually, in the course of wanting this one person to be free of suffering, eventually one starts to realize that self-centeredness, selfishness, is a tremendous source of suffering. In fact, it's the core. It's the core of all suffering. It's built upon self-centeredness. So if we actually really genuinely have compassion for ourselves, then at some point we start chipping away at our self-centeredness. And one of the main ways of doing that is through caring about others, helping others, actively trying to do things to help and support others. And coming to etymology, this is hinted at in the word karuna. So the word karuna also comes from the root kar, so the same root from which we get karma, so action, conduct, behavior. The same root from which we get the verb karoti, to do something, to make something, to build something. So the word karuna already implies that this is an active thing. So it's not just like a pretty thought you have in your mind while you go around selfishly abusing other people for your own benefit. But karuna is something which manifests through activity, manifests through everything that we do. So when the mind is focused upon compassion, upon reducing the suffering of living beings, then naturally that will affect how we speak and how we act. So that everything we say and everything we do is motivated by the wish to help beings become free of suffering. So those are a few thoughts to add to the topic. Bhante Jay, would you like to say a few words on the topic?
Sure. Yes, I like to split compassion into two types: mundane and transcendent. And what I like to say is the Buddha's most vaunted compassion is actually a transcendent compassion. And this is what I mean by this. Mundane compassion is like a mother's love, right? It is the typical compassion that most people have. We have, if you know about mothers have much love and compassion for their child. But if there's any being, you ever hear about like getting in between a mama bear and her cub, but if there's any being that might have any kind of threat to the child, then the compassion goes away and the viciousness comes out, right? And so this is what we typically, when we have mundane compassion, where we see something and we're driven by like an emotion and we think, oh, we should help this person. And then oftentimes what we'll do is, they're the cause. We're going to go after them, right? So it feeds into our us versus them, our in-group, out-group mechanisms that we already have in our mind, right? The Buddha's compassion, if you see in the suttas, in the Brahma Viharas, how the Buddha says to practice compassion, one abides pervading the all-encompassing world with a mind of compassion. 1 quarter, 2nd quarter, 3rd quarter, 4th quarter. Likewise, above, below, all around, to all and to himself, right? this is a different kind of compassion. This is actually a compassion that comes from wisdom. Right? This is a compassion that comes from seeing a wider view of things, right? It's said in the suttas that the Buddha is like one who's on the top of the mountain and can see all the beings in samsara suffering, right? Imagine being able to just try to imagine for a second being a Buddha and being able to just see countless beings going around doing stupid things because their greed, hatred, and delusion. It's like, oh my God, these poor beings. Right? So like the true transcendent compassion comes from your wisdom. Right? And this is where I think, I very, very rarely praise another tradition over Theravada, but this is where I believe that the Tibetan tradition, I think, handles compassion very well, where they have the simile of the bird with two wings, right? Just as a bird has two wings needed to fly, so too compassion needs wisdom. I think that's such a very wise thing, because you can see one of the things, and I know I'm pretty much the only monastic that talks like this, but I think it comes from my experience in life of just how compassion can be misused, abused, weaponized, and all kinds of things. And I think there's a very, very wise, a very deep wisdom in the fact that they're saying that compassion needs to be coupled with wisdom, and also that the deepest compassion, right? The compassion that goes beyond, the compassion that can see both the person being hurt and the person hurting as a being in samsara, as both suffering, right? That's a transcendent, wise compassion. That's a very, very deep compassion. That's obviously not something most of us can do, right? Just like in the Kakachupama Sutta, the simile of the saw, where the Buddha says, if somebody is to be sawing your limbs off, if you were to have any ill will in your mind, then you're not doing my teaching. Obviously, most of us would not be able to do that, right? So having true compassion for all of us siblings in suffering, right? All of us beings in samsara, that's the true, deep, wise compassion. And that's the compassion that we can work towards and develop ourselves and practice with. So that's what I have to say.
Great. Thank you, Venerables. And AES actually has a question I see here. Is trying to see ourselves in others and vice versa practicing compassion? If yes, how to develop the skill of seeing ourselves in others and others in us? Well, I'll try to answer. I don't know exactly what you mean by trying to see ourselves in others and vice versa. But I will say, maybe I'll share something I think it might be slightly relevant. But anyway, when I came to the practice, I came with this really strong sense of self-identity, that I was this like really incredible, unique being. And incredible, I don't mean like amazing, like incredibly unique. Like in both in the, the awful qualities of mine and in the good qualities of mine, or rather than mine, whatever. Like, me, I am like creative in this specific way, or I am really terrible in this specific way, or I'm really depressed in this specific way. And all of my like different life experiences, so different from everyone else. I lived in all these places in Italy, and I went to this other country, and then I went to this other country, and I did this type of job, and I come from this family that has this specific, connotation, etc. So all my life, I always thought I was such a unique person. That's probably also why I never went to a therapist, because I thought, well, no therapist could really quite understand what I've been through. I'm just like so unique, right? Like, unless I find someone who's been exact like my photocopy, they will never get me. And then I started Buddhist practice, and we started actually this monastery retreat center in New York City together with Bhante Sudaso. And it was has always been an international place from day one. So there are all the different people coming from all walks of life, and we're all practicing together. And literally, we only had ever, because that's usually how monastery works or places of Dharma work. The only thing that we have in common altogether is really our interest in the Dharma, and that's it. You start talking about anything else, it's actually relatively easy to not do idle talk when there are people from different countries. Because, if I start talking about like the movies that are popular in Italy, like hardly anybody here, for example, in the room will ever know. When Americans start talking about their pop culture references, I'm completely clueless, and so forth. There's also a different sense of humor. Something that maybe in Italy is funny. In America, it's not. And of course, if you get then Iraq, Sri Lanka, China, Iran, Spain, France, like we had people literally from all over the world. So what was very interesting to me, that after a while of practicing together and seeing, I was always there kind of, because I was organizing, and people were kind of shifting over and over. And I started noticing, first of all, we all have the same questions. Literally everybody has the same questions. And I would remember also the questions that I would ask as well. Like they usually frequently ask questions. If there is no self, then who gets reborn? For example, I remember being the person asking that question. Or, all sorts of questions like that. But also the same kind of difficulties within the practice. They just manifest slightly in the same way, but we're all addicted to food in one particular way or the other. It just manifests in a different way if you were raised in Italy or if you were raised in in the United States. And addicted to food means also maybe rejecting food, but having those kind of relationships. And we see how basically the Dhamma speaks to to us, people that are living in is it the 21st century? I'm losing track, getting older. And people, in the 21st century, from all walks of life, from all different places in the world, we're struggling with exactly the same difficulties than people in ancient India 2,500 years ago. And it's this really humbling experience. At a certain point, I remember when we were studying actually how to receive admonishment, there is actually these instructions that the Buddha gives us. And the first time I read that sutta, I started laughing because I was like, oh dear, yeah, guilty, don't get angry back and start shouting mean things to the person who's admonishing you. And I'm like, oops, don't start changing subject and talk about unrelated things. I was like, oops, don't get sulky. Don't start talking about the other person that is admonishing you. And I found it so interesting how basically in 2,500 years, nothing had ever changed. So in that sense, basically we start seeing, and that's basically what I was kind of referring to as well with Anukampa, the translation of Anukampa, of trembling together, is that we're all basically suffering. We all have the same disease, essentially. It just manifests in a slightly different way. And when we go past these differences, then we see, that we're all, different bundles of greed, hatred, and delusion. Essentially, you've got the Italian female version. Here you've got the two American male versions, one of Italian descent, one of German, Polish descent, and so forth. So it doesn't, we maybe can get very caught up in, Ayasoma is like this, Ayasoma is, et cetera, and Bhaktisiddhasa is this way, and Bhante is this way. But in reality, we're all having the experience of suffering. And in reality, we're all, that's why the Dhamma works for each one of us. It's such a potent medicine. And compassion is this powerful means through which then we can understand this, and then we can talk about we can experience that transcendental compassion that Bhante is talking about, because we understand that it's not personal. We understand that all of this, it's just how things are. It has nothing to do with me, just me being so particular and so unique. But rather it's just a human experience, essentially. So I don't know if I actually addressed your question. That's exactly what you were talking about. But in terms, if you're interested in developing this skill, yes, just reflect on yourself. Look at yourself. Look at how you're experiencing suffering, and look at how others are experiencing suffering. And in that way, you see that essentially that was my journey. I was like, oh yeah, I'm really just a commoner. Like no different than anyone else. Really not that special.
Yeah, and actually where I think the practice of seeing others is not different from ourselves, where I see that practice really helpful is in practicing forgiveness and tolerance. Because again, we think that we're unique, but actually for the most part, we're the product of our environment, our cultural upbringing, our conditioning. So why do we believe what we believe? Why do we act the way we act? Why do we think things should be done this way and not that way? And so again, you think, oh, well, this is my preferences. It's what I like to do. Then you start reflecting on it and you're like, well, actually, I like the music I like because my sister really likes that kind of music and she got me listening to it. Or I think that pasta should be made this way because that one friend of mine taught me to make pasta this way. Or like, you start thinking about it and you're like, well, what in my entire life did I ever actually invent of my own accord without any input from the outside world at all? The more you think about it, the more you realize that pretty much every decision you've ever made, every preference you have, every habit you have is in some way influenced by the experiences that you've had, the people that you've met, the country that you live in, the parents that you had, and so on. And so then if you had different parents, different culture, different upbringing, different experiences, then you might behave differently. You might have a different set of likes and dislikes, a different idea of what's rude and what's polite, a different idea of the right way and the wrong way to do things. And that means that you might turn out being very much like whoever you're currently having a hard time tolerating. So the person who's doing something that you dislike, well, under a different set of circumstances, you might behave in exactly the same way. And actually, the Buddha also says that when we reflect on the sheer scope of samsara, that samsara has no discoverable beginning, then you realize that over the course of countless eons, where we keep shifting from one kind of life to another, at some point we actually have been exactly identical to the person we're looking at. At some point we have gone through exactly the experiences that they've gone through. At some point we have seen the world exactly the way that they see the world. At some point we have had exactly the same ideas and habits and preferences that they have. So then you can recognize, like, oh, this person is actually not completely inappropriate or weird or far out. They're actually, I could be exactly like them if things had gone a bit differently. And in fact, I have been exactly like them in past lives. But for me, that has less to do with compassion and more to do with an ability to forgive others, or at a bare minimum to tolerate others. Having compassion for others, I think the main way that we do that is through connecting to each other on a very simple basis of we all are immersed in dukkha. There is actually one thing which every single being in samsara all has in common: dukkha. And of course, we like to tell our particular stories about my dukkha. So my dukkha has these particular stories around it, but fundamentally it's just dukkha. It's just the experience of dukkha, the feeling of dukkha. So anyone who's unawakened experiences dukkha. So in this, we're all exactly the same. And every single person wants to be free of dukkha. And in this, again, we're all exactly the same. And everything else is just details. So the details of your dukkha actually don't matter at all. What matters is that we have this sincere wish to be free of dukkha, and so does everybody else. So in that, we're exactly the same. Do you have anything you want to add on that, or should I take the next question?
No, I was going to go into all the ways that the Buddha, and you already went into it, like, the seeing that we've gone through the same thing in our past life, or, those kind of ways that this person could be my mother, all those kind of ways that the Buddha wants us to connect with other beings. So you already covered that. It's good.
And Chita, maybe you can answer Chita's question.
Why are people in the helping professions, such as teachers, healthcare workers, social workers, social justice advocates, suffering from compassion fatigue and burnout? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, expectation. That's what it is. So Bhante said this to me because my career before this was child protective services. So when you're talking about these kind of professions, there's a lot of issues. Firstly, the government or the organization that you're working for, the bureaucracy is causing half the problems. That's the first thing, right? So you're dealing with bureaucracy and ridiculousness, horrible supervisors, all that jazz. Secondly, the people who, like the career I had, the burnout rate was about 3 years. I lasted 8, and then I became a monk. So a much better way to leave the job than others. But no, and this is because, my whole life I've wanted to help people. I've always had the ethos. I had the knight ethos, right? Like I wanted to be the person that helped others. And every job that I've done, even becoming a monk, it still is helping others. And, I learned the hard way that you actually have a limited ability to do much in these jobs. You really do. So if you have an expectation that you're going to do more, or that you should be able to do X or Y, then you're going to suffer. You're going to burn out. You're not going to be able to, it's like, I mean, people would say like, how do you like do the job you do and then just go home? And I said, oh, it's kind of easy for me. Like I work with all women and most of them are mothers. How do mothers do the job I do and then go home? That's like a lot harder because, you're dealing with kids. And so it's like, if you're not able to also, this is another thing about compassion, right? The Buddha talks about this quite often. Like if I have a family or if I have a client or somebody that's suffering, if I get down with them and I'm just crying with them and that's like me getting in the mud with them. Like I can't help them if I'm in the mud with them all the time, right? I have to be able to be empathetic, not sympathetic, 2 different words, empathetic, and understand maybe what they're going through and help them. And so people don't understand these kind of things and they feel like they're being blocked all the time, whether it's by the bureaucracy, whether it's by the people you're working with, whether it's by the universe, whatever it is. And so a lot of frustration happens, right? Their ability to do something about whatever they want to do something about is not matching their desire of what they want to do. And that causes a lot of suffering. That causes a lot of burnout. It says, well, why am I doing this job? I'm not really helping anybody. Like, honestly, I did it for 8 years. I worked with 200 families. I probably helped about 3 people. Somewhere around there, right? So if you think like, oh, I'm going to get in this job and I'm going to help all these people, you have to have if you don't allow yourself to come to a more realistic understanding of what you're doing, what you can do, what your limits are, what the limits of government and organizations are, then you're going to suffer. I always say it's the same with everything. Expectations equal suffering.
Yeah, so I mean, realistically, we should always start with the expectation that we're going to try really hard and get absolutely nothing to show for it. And then whatever you do get, so 3, that's a much higher number than 0. Congratulations.
Yeah.
That's why you got a round of applause. So you got a non-zero number of people helped. That's pretty good. So you start with the idea that you're going to try really hard to help other people, but that you might wind up getting absolutely no results whatsoever. But that's okay, because you're trying. You're making a sincere effort, and that's what's important.
You want to know the worst compliment I've ever gotten in my life, that I got multiple times in my career? You're the best worker I ever had. When you think about that, think about how sad that is, especially if it's somebody who's multiple generations. Like, they might have had like 7 or 8 workers, and you're like, wait, nothing. They're in this condition. They've been with so many ex people all these years, and nothing has happened. What am I supposed to do? It was like a thanks for the compliment, but that's actually kind of depressing.
But yeah, and it also reminds me of again, like addiction recovery programs. Their success rate is extremely low, but the point is their success rate is higher than 0.
Yeah.
And again, in terms of our own practice, though, we practice compassion first and foremost to help ourselves. So trying to be of benefit to others benefits ourselves, even if we wind up not having much actual effect on other people. The fact that we're trying to help other people still purifies our own heart and polishes our own heart.
So I moved to helping the most amount of people in the best way, becoming a Buddhist monk that shares that's the best way to help.
Which actually segues nicely into the next question. Anthony says, are there any discourses in which the Buddha discusses the connection between compassion and non-self, like how teaching beings that all things are impersonal is the best compassion? Actually, the first thing which comes to mind is in a few places in the suttas, the Buddha says that awakened beings appear in the world for the benefit of many, for the benefit of the general populace. So this actually points directly to the fact that our practice of attaining awakening, so whether as an arhat or a Sammasambuddha, our practice of attaining awakening is one which is done for the benefit of countless sentient beings. So not just for our own benefit, but for the benefit of countless beings. And as for teaching others, so, I mean, teaching beings that all things are impersonal, well, and let's be realistic. If somebody's starving to death and you walk up and you say, all things are impersonal, and that's very cute, but is that compassion? And is it actually going to help anybody? I mean, maybe. There are these occasional rare cases of somebody whose mind is already primed for receiving the Dhamma, and they just receive a small teaching and they have a deep realization. But that's very uncommon. It's very uncommon. So usually you want to try to meet people where they're actually at, and convey the Dhamma in a way which is actually relevant to them. And also ask yourself how you actually can help the people that are in front of you. So of course, teaching Dhamma is important, but actually the teachings on anatta are quite advanced, and you need to know the right time to talk about such things, and the right time to talk about more foundational practices. So if somebody doesn't have a good foundation in generosity, morality, and concentration, then talking about anatta is not likely to bring much benefit. It might bring a little bit. Some people actually have a immediate connection to very advanced Dhamma topics. But generally speaking, it's the foundational practices which we have to keep coming back to over and over and over again. Because until that foundation is built up very strongly, the advanced teachings aren't going to have much effect on us. So, of course, teaching Dhamma, the Buddha says, Dhamma danang sabbadanang janati. So the gift of Dhamma is better than all other gifts. So in that sense, yeah, teaching the Dhamma is the most compassionate thing you can do. But it's also something that has to be done carefully. So your ability to teach Dhamma depends upon the strength of your own practice and the extent of your own Dhamma knowledge. But also, it's not meant to be a substitute for more basic forms of compassion. So I mean, I wouldn't just go and replace all of the social services programs with recordings that say everything is impersonal. I don't really think that'd be the proper way of practicing compassion. Do you have any thoughts on this? Okay.
I actually, I don't know if this is coming from the question per se, but there, and Bhante actually briefly mentioned it, that kind of, there has to be like, a lot of people can be really deluded when it comes to anatta and jhanas too. Those are the two big ones that seem to have the most deluded people. Like people going around talking about themselves saying, these 5 aggregates are hungry. These 5. So like, trying to say things like, oh, it's only 5 aggregates. What are you complaining about? Like that can be a very, or even saying like, why do I have to be compassionate for the 5 aggregates or these persons 5? I can just see it going in some really diluted ways. And Bhante also pointed to, it's like the important thing is like, even if you say, oh yeah, no, they're just 5 aggregates. Well, yeah, but those 5 aggregates still experience suffering, right? And you still don't want to, you still want to minimize your 5 aggregates having suffering and other beings having suffering too. Yeah.
It actually reminds me of a story. These 2 monks, both of them are very senior now, but this was a long time ago when one of them was junior monk, recently ordained, and the other one had been a monk for several years already. So the junior monk was bringing water for the senior monk's bath, and it was and the way they would do it at that time. So this was in the forest, so they didn't have bathtubs and shower stalls and so on. So they would have like a place in the forest where there's kind of a curtained off area, and the junior monk would bring buckets of water and like dump it over the top, like a extremely low-tech shower. And so the junior monk was bringing like buckets of ice cold water and like dumping it over the top, and he'd dump it over, and the senior monk was like, so cold. And the junior monk was like, God, this guy is such a whiner. What's he going on about? It's just Dukkha Vedana, seriously. And he dumps in another bucket of freezing cold water. And he said then afterwards, he finally realized that he should have been bringing warm water. And it was this realization of like, oh, I am actually inflicting suffering on somebody else unnecessarily. And of course, we can kind of whitewash it with the Dhamma of like, well, it's their fault. It's their fault for not having strong enough equanimity. But actually, at some point, he realized actually it was his own fault. It was his own fault for not being considerate enough to bring warm water instead of cold water. So it's the same with our practice. Again, we need to be very careful that we don't use the Dhamma as an excuse to disregard the suffering of others, as an excuse to disregard the effect that we have on others, and the fact that we can have an effect that is either pleasant or unpleasant. And we can have an effect that's either beneficial or harmful. And we can't just kind of sweep it all under the carpet with like, oh, anicca dukkha anatta, get over it. But actually, we really need to pay attention. And again, considering how does it feel when you're on the other end of things? How does it feel when you're the guy that's getting bucketed with ice cold water? Maybe not such a nice experience. And Rick has a question. This actually is very similar to the previous one. Can you share some practical ways we can act with skillful compassion and not get caught up in unhealthy caretaking?
Maybe I can share a few things.
Okay.
What comes to mind that hasn't been said so far is actually creating boundaries is very important. So we tend to coming back to actually what we were saying earlier as well, in terms of that sense of sacrifice that we can kind of embed in compassion. We tend to think, okay, well, I'm doing something for others, so that is it's a very good thing, and it's the supreme thing. And then we kind of start erasing ourselves and putting 100% of our time, our effort, our energy in one person or one situation or one occupation, and completely erasing ourselves. And we tend to think that that is the correct way of doing things, but actually there's actually a sutta where the Buddha talks about 4 kinds of people that really struck my mind. I remember I was like, it was one of those moments where, you know, I have a lot of Dhammasuka because I love the Dhamma, because sometimes it's so counterintuitive. Actually, not sometimes, most of the time. And this one was one of them, where the Buddha talks about 4 kinds of people. The person who practices for the benefit of themselves and the benefit of others, and then the person who practices for the benefit of themselves and not for the benefit of others, and the person who practices for the how do you say, the not benefit,
neither.
Detriment.
The detriment of oneself and others, and the person who practices for the detriment, for their merit. I can't speak English anymore. The benefit of themselves and the detriment of the other person. Anyway, obviously he makes who is the superior person, and obviously the superior person is the person who practices for the benefit of themselves and others. And of course, the person at the bottom of the list is the one that does the worst for themselves and others. But interestingly enough, the person who is superior to the other is the one that actually, like in the second category, is the one who at least practices for the benefit of themselves, rather than the one who practices for the benefit of others. And that's because if you don't practice for your benefit first, then you're incapable of benefiting others, essentially. So this is why it's very important to create boundaries and understand that it's absolutely necessary. It's basically, if you have kind of like a field, and you're not watering the plants, you're doing every single thing, like you're putting all the conditions to grow tomatoes, but you're not watering the tomatoes. Like, you have to water the ground, the soil. You are the soil there. Like, you are creating the conditions in order for fruits to come up, where that then you can benefit and also others can benefit as well. So it's very important to really look at what you're currently doing if you're in a caretaking situation, and first familiarize yourself with that tendency of mind. You know, there's especially if we are taking care of family members, for example, it's very difficult to put a boundary there, right? If we're sharing the same room or the same apartment, the same building, it can be very, very, very difficult to do that. Well, we need to learn how to do that. If it's strangers, same thing. Maybe it's our job. Are we capable of actually leaving the job there? Or are we bringing it home? And by bringing it home, we're bringing it in our minds, constantly thinking, which is very connected to what also Bhante J was saying. So that expectation of not being able to let go of what we would like for things to be, other than that, than what we're actually experiencing or that we're capable of doing and offering. So these are a few thoughts. Pardon my broken English.
I would like to add just one thing in terms of caretaking. One of the things that actually is not really talked about, but that is actually important, is being able to bear that the other person is suffering, so that you can actually go and do what you need to do to help yourself so you can help the person. Like, sometimes if you haven't showered in days, or you're doing this, or you need just a rest because you're getting to the point, and if you've been a caregiver long enough, I know I have been, you'll have things come into your mind like, why am I dealing with this person? Why don't this person just go to the hospital or die or whatever, right? That will happen. Yeah, it's funny, but that's literally come to my mind. There's like, oh God, this is exhausting. And what that's saying is that's your mind saying you've overdone it. You need to, if they're suffering, it's okay. It's their suffering. They're going to have to just deal with it for a while. You need to take care of yourself, and then you can go back and help them. But this is an important thing to like. A lot of the reasons why we like, oh, we don't want to see this person suffering. It's actually our aversion to watching somebody suffer. There's for instance, like a lot of people will say, oh yeah, killing is bad. We know, we're Buddhists. We know killing is bad, but my dog, I just want to euthanize the dog. It'll be better for the dog. Will it? This is the thing. This is interesting. We have a strong aversion to the thought that anybody will have to deal with suffering, but that's existence. And so part of wisdom, I think, sometimes is knowing that, okay, they're going to suffer, and maybe you can do something about it. Maybe you can't do something about it, but maybe you actually have to have a boundary where you take care of yourself, and then you go back and you're not burnt out and you're not having negative thoughts towards the being that you're caretaking. And then you give them, the time. And sometimes beings that are suffering might need that time for themselves, for their own long-term benefit and growth in the Dhamma and understanding and wisdom, and for the future lives. So yeah, that's all.
Awesome. Okay. And good to see you, Zach, our friend who we actually met a few hours ago, where we're coming on the train back to the empty cloud. Good to see you. What a nice surprise.
And summary says, how to practice compassion for people who have been abusive to you. Ajahn Jayasaro said, real compassion is also not to let others abuse or exploit you, and to confront them or cut off ties with them. Yeah, so in terms of others who have been abusive to us, well, actually the very first thing to do is to recognize that that person is suffering and they are abusing you because of their own dukkha. And if they were free of dukkha, then they would not be abusing you. So therefore, you wish for them to be free of dukkha. So that's natural. So rather than wishing for them to suffer, well, because actually if they're suffering more, then they're just going to be even more confused and even more inclined to cause problems for others. Instead, you wish for them to be free of suffering, because then they would stop inflicting harm on others in that case. So, but you also need to be practical. So if you are in a situation where somebody else is abusing you and you choose to remain in that condition, then you have made a choice. You've created karma. You've made a decision to put yourself in an abusive situation. So that's actually not compassion for yourself. So removing yourself from the harmful situation is compassion for yourself. That's very important. Also, you are removing the opportunity for the other person to cause harm. So, for example, if somebody is a child abuser, well, then you put them somewhere where they don't have access to any children. And then they're much less likely to abuse children. If they don't have access to any, then they can't abuse any. So if somebody is abusing you, well, then put yourself out of their reach. And then since they don't have the opportunity to generate bad karma, then they'll stop. Or it might at least get them to rethink what they're doing and start to realize that maybe it's time to do something else with their life. But at least it gets them to interrupt their accumulation of bad karma for a little while. As for confronting them, there's a time to confront people and there's a time to just get away from them. And you have to know when which time is. Often confronting people is not really useful. It just winds up putting fuel on the fire. Often it's better just to cut ties and get them out of your life and move on. You had something you wanted to say?
No, that's good.
Hi.
No, it's pretty good.
Okay, next we have a fun question from Zach. Zach says, does Buddhism relate any end game that justifies the existence of dukkha in a comparable sense to theistic religion as serving a divine purpose for man's growth, rectification, and salvation? I tend to think of dukkha more as like this one phenomenally stupid mistake that we keep making over and over and over again, moment after moment after moment. So I actually don't think of it as serving any particular purpose other than something that we really need to learn how to stop doing as quickly as possible.
There's this concept that I've come across that is like, and it's not Buddhist, obviously, but this concept of like, you're being put through multiple lives so that you can keep learning a lesson. And then the end, like, this kind of concept of like multiple lives being an evolution. Right. So I've come across this concept before. Obviously, no, this is not in Buddhism, like, an evolution, like at the end, you're going to be some, wise cosmic being or something like that, like in terms of like, it's not that. That's not the concept. The concept is to get out of samsara and to, to end your suffering. That's the concept. And then that's the goal. That's the goal. And that's the consolation prize. And, yeah.
As I see it, as I understand it, it's more just like a natural state of things. So it's kind of no different than an earthquake. It's really unpleasant. No, nobody really wants to be in an earthquake, but that's just how things are. So it's just a natural phenomenon. So we tend to understand physical phenomena as what they are, but then we don't quite have the same approach towards our experience of suffering. We tend to think that there must be a purpose for it. Like, is there a purpose for an earthquake? Yeah, I guess there's a purpose in the sense of like, I don't know, the tectonic, whatever. I remember studying something like that in school and science, etc. But is there really an ultimate purpose? Not really. It's just how things are. It kind of just sucks, It just sucks. But there's also like pleasant things in nature. And I remember when I got to practice, today I have a lot of stories of when I came to practice. I remember actually Bhante Sudazo was giving a Dhamma talk. And I remember saying something. I was really angry at a certain point. He would actually like make me both like very happy with the Dhamma and very also angry with the Dhamma. Not him, like just the Dhamma in general because of my wrong view. I remember like lifting up my hand and saying something along the lines, but all of this, like basically I think was related to suffering is natural. Like, why are we trying to do anything about it? Like, this is all natural. And he's like, yeah, also what is it, chikota? I can't remember in English, the poison thing, hemlock. Also hemlock is natural. But that doesn't mean that you want to like drink hemlock, like have hemlock, like poison yourself, right? So we tend to think that everything that is natural is somewhat good, but no, it's just the way it is. It's just how things are, and the Buddha explains to us how things are, and then he gives us an option. Do you actually want to go against nature? Because literally being happy, removing suffering is going against nature. It's going, in fact, against the stream. It's unnatural to go against the stream, but it's possible. So I would remove any kind of like idea that there is a purpose with all of this. There's just no purpose. But finally, someone is explaining to us what's going on, because we have all sorts of theories and ideas and fabrications. And people before there was like more advanced science, they had lots of ideas and fabrications and so forth, also on the physical world. Now we have, the law of gravity. We understand it's just how things are. It kind of sucks that things fall, when you, if you don't want them to fall, but it's just, that's the way things are. And when we understand it, then it stops hurting. It stops surprising us in a bad way or the other.
Okay, and a few of these questions are a little off topic. But maybe we could, what do you think? Should we take this or save it for monk chat?
No, let's take it. Let's see.
Okay. And Zach also says, if existence is suffering, then what is the right view which will allow us to maintain a positive approach to our own existence? Well, existence is not suffering, but rather existence when tainted by desire, attachment, and delusion is suffering. So the right view which allows one to maintain a positive approach is recognizing that we have the ability to reduce our desires and attachments, to increase our wisdom, which then has the effect of reducing our suffering and increasing our happiness. So that's what gives us a positive attitude. It's recognizing that through identifying the causes of our suffering, we can remove those causes and start to experience more and more happiness. So this is the second, third, and fourth noble truths. So if Buddhism was just the first noble truth, yeah, that would be pretty depressing and pointless. I agree. And in fact, there was a couple hundred years ago, a group of Christian missionaries actually went to Buddhist countries and started trying to convert people based upon exactly that line of like, the Buddha teaches that life is suffering. How depressing. Who would want to believe that? And it's like, well, because one, that's not quite what the Buddha taught. And two, there's the second, third, and fourth noble truths. If you fixate only on the first one, yeah, of course that's depressing. But the second, third, and fourth noble truths are actually extremely positive, optimistic, uplifting things to reflect upon. So that's what I would recommend. Good. Should we keep going?
Mm-hmm.
And this person says, is helping our friend during exams to get some marks to clear the exams compassion or wrong karma?
This is great for Bhante J.
No, it's not compassion, because what you're doing is you're actually encouraging and enabling the person to act unskillfully, right? To want to do cheating or to manipulate things, these kind of things. That's not compassionate. You know, if your compassion enables somebody to harm themselves or to harm others or to do wrong, do wrong actions, that's not compassion. That people can feel like pressured into doing that, especially if it's a friend. You don't like me anymore. You're not a good friend if you don't do this, yada, yada, yada. But just like a parent, right? The Buddha is talking to a king, and the Buddha asks if, you would ever harm the child. Right. And he says, yeah, well, if the child is choking, I might have to, put my finger, I might actually have to harm the child to help the child. Right. And the Buddha says, likewise, this is how I, some of my disciples, I need to be, gruff with some of my disciples to help them. Right. So, this is not, this is weaponized compassion. This is one of the examples of weaponized compassion. Well, if you really liked me, you do yada, 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 or this kind of thing. No. That's somebody manipulating you. That's not, no. So no, I would say no. It's, is it wrong karma on your end? Yes, I guess so. I would say, although I wouldn't say it's like too, it's not good for you and it's not good for them. That's what I would say. Even if they're going to fail, they might say, oh, if I don't pass this test, I'm going to fail out. Well, maybe they need to fail out to have a lesson in life and become a greater person later on in life. You don't know. So.
Okay. And this person says, how can you tell someone something that can't take criticism very well and it makes them sad, no matter how nicely you tell them? Well, the art of giving and receiving admonishment, Ayasoma mentioned briefly earlier that the Buddha talks about these in the suttas in a few places. And giving admonishment, the Buddha gives 5 instructions. So you should only say what's true. You should only say what's beneficial. You should only say it gently. You should only say it when your mind is full of loving kindness, and you should only say it at the right time. So 5 conditions. So often you're like, well, it's true and it's beneficial, and who cares about the others? I'm just going to say it. And so, of course, that usually doesn't go over very well. So be very careful that you're hitting all 5 of these points. And if the person still doesn't take it well, what are you going to do? I mean, you can't control other people. But really, be really clear with yourself, because we do tend to do these justifications of like, 2 out of 5, 3 out of 5, good enough. But really try to have 5 out of 5. And then you'll find things go much more smoothly. And also dig more deeply into them. So is it true? It's like, well, a friend of a friend told it to me. So, well, okay. That doesn't mean it's true. It just means a friend of a friend told it to you. Make sure it's actually really true. Or beneficial. Again, dig a bit more deeply. Is it actually beneficial? Do you really need to say this? Is it really going to help anybody? And really considering, what is the right time to say something? Maybe for someone, it's 99% of the time it's the wrong time. Well, then look really closely for that other 1%. Look really closely for the right opportunity. So really dig into these five points on how to deliver admonishment correctly. Okay. And this person says, if people push you to get into worldly stuff when you feel like detaching, then how can one explain to them to give you some space?
This is not really about compassion.
Okay.
I think bring it back tomorrow for mock chat.
Yes, that's actually closely related to the topic that we'll be doing for the weekend program. The joy of missing out.
Oh, yeah. That's right.
Sid says, would it still count if one acts compassionate if one does compassionate acts while not feeling anything at all? For example, although you don't feel metta, you still act for the benefit of someone?
I would say yes, fake it till you make it. But but yeah, there's mixed karma. I mean, we tend to think of an action as being just one action with one result, but there's lots of different things that go into it. So your intention here would be to act compassionately. So you're still acting compassionately. Maybe your intention is to act compassionately because in theory, that is a good thing to do. So you do it, but it still comes from a good intention. It's not, for example, now I'm pretending to act compassionately so then I can get something in return. Like those people will like me, and then who cares what happens to this person later? Like all of that then is a lot of bad karma, bad intentions, although you're still doing a good action. But here, I think what you're describing, like not having mind full of loving kindness or a compassionate mind while doing a compassionate act, it's part of the practice. So one needs to be also realistic. This is a practice. It's not a pill. Like, it's not that we just we understand the Dhamma, then we take a pill and boom, oh yeah, I'm like all peace and love, loving everybody, boom, enlightenment. No, it's a practice. So we need to train ourselves. We need to also understand how a compassionate mind, first and foremost, benefits ourselves, whether we're actually doing the act or not. I mean, we can also cultivate the Brahma Viharas through meditation practice. So understanding that this is something that brightens the mind, beautifies the mind. But it takes some time to understand that experientially. First, we understand it intellectually, and first we practice, we take it. And in Italian, we have this saying, appetite comes through eating. So keep on eating compassion, and then you'll have an appetite for it.
And summary says, sometimes abuse by a bully is very difficult to spot, and it is too late when realized. There's shame and regret for not recognizing it early enough to walk out and not being self-compassionate. How to deal with it.
I like this. I know what you're talking about. Yeah, that comes once again with same as actually before, trial and error. So it's part of the practice. And you're actually in a really good spot where you're understanding the dynamic. So you can't, fix the past, but you can figure out what the dynamic is and then make different choices based on your analysis right here, right now, that will have different consequences in the future. So we can't move forward in the path if we don't actually take advantage of the mistakes that we do, both if we're the perpetrator or we are the victim. It really doesn't matter, in the sense that as in unenlightened beings, we will be in both scenarios very often until, like, it's just part of the path. And so in each moment, we need to, understand that this is just how things are. And sometimes it's very difficult to spot and too late when realized. Well, maybe it's too late to stop it, but it's not too late to realize it. It's right there. You can do, once again, the assessment. And so shame and regret, they're very hard emotions. So I would suggest to also investigate those emotions, understanding that they're not useful, they're not beneficial, and they're probably an impediment for you to move forward. You're not being compassionate towards yourself in that moment. So I think it's a learning experience. I don't know if the other venerables have something else to.
Yeah, I just add, like, shame and regret are mechanisms for change, right? Like, shame and regret are often pointing towards, like, oh, I should have did this better, or I should have done this, or should have done that. And you question it, you investigate it, you reflect on it, and you say, okay, well, from here on in, I want to do better, and you have to kind of, like, just being marred in shame and regret for the rest of your life is not actually, you're not going to progress. You're stuck in it, right? It's not meant to be there like a weight that you're carrying around your whole life. It's meant to be something like pointing you towards, well, you should have done this, right? It's not that you should have known. Like, if you're ignorant to something or you can't see something, there's no blame, right? It's not like you just didn't know, and now you know, so now you do better in the future, right? So shame and regret are not necessarily bad things. It's only if you don't move forward and just kind of mire in them that they become suffering.
Yeah. And Knut has a question, but I think it's more of a monk chat question. So if you could bring it to monk chat, we'd be happy to answer it at that time. And Pial and Indira ask, are there any sutta texts directly referencing the practice of self-compassion? Yes, countless. Because most of the time when the Buddha talks about metta and karuna in the suttas, he's always saying that, first off, it's for all beings. So all beings include yourself by default. And also he makes this statement to others as to oneself. So again, this idea that it's always practicing compassion for oneself as well as compassion for others. So it's almost always built into how the Buddha defines compassion or how he speaks about compassion. It's not making a distinction between self and others. It's just wanting everyone to be happy, wanting everyone to be free of suffering, wanting to help every being that we have an effect on. And naturally, that includes ourselves, because we're actually right at the center of our sphere of influence. So naturally, we're fully included in every effort of compassion. Yeah. And that's the last question from online. Does anybody here at the monastery have a question related to compassion? No? Okay.
I think we can take Knut's last question.
I'm having much compassion arise for Knut because he's one of my favorite people from the Buddhist Insight days.
I know. I also really like Knut. So I was feeling a little bit.
We all love you, Knut.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. So Knut says, I'm really struggling with my practice. Last night I had a meditation session in person, and I log on to a session or so with you each week. And yet I feel like I should be doing more, and I should meditate more consistently. How do I either make my practice more robust or just get to a place where I accept where I am? Just a moment ago, you both really wanted to answer this question.
No, I just said I had compassion for him. I didn't say anything about answering the question.
Well, I mean, first off, the first thing is actually to appreciate the practice that you do. So the vast majority of people in the world do exactly 0. You do more than 0. That's awesome. So start by giving yourself a good pat on the back. I'm awesome. I did some meditation last night. Wow, good for me. Most people in the world didn't. I do a live stream Dharma session about once a week. Wow, that's awesome. Most people don't. I'm substantially better than most people. Wow. You're well above average when it comes to Dharma practice. So, of course, it's nice to do more, but start off by congratulating yourself about all the greatness you're already doing. And then that will naturally give you a positive association with practice, and it will naturally build up your enthusiasm to practice more. Similarly, constantly pay attention to and remind yourself of the benefits you've received from practicing. Remind yourself of the blessings that you experience in your life, either currently or in the past, as a result of practicing Buddhism. And similarly, that will help to build up your enthusiasm for practice and your wish to practice more. But ultimately, again, it really has to start with appreciating where you are currently, praising yourself for every bit of practice that you do. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, perfect.
I don't know if he's saying that he meditates wants to meditate more consistently. I don't know if he's saying that he meditates every day or not, or something like that. But what I did want to add was, if you are you want to make your meditation practice more robust or more consistent, you have to start small. It's about building habits, right? So that's important. Start small. Try to do a little bit every day, even if it's 5 minutes. And the other thing is, try to start building out your practice to trying to do mindfulness in all of your activities, right? If you start doing that, like one of the things that I started doing that was very beneficial for me. I learned it at Bhavana years ago, but a million different teachers teach it and call it different names. But I call it 1 in 59, meaning like the last minute of every hour, you just stop and pause and just follow your breath, right? Training your mind to kind of stop and pause and practice mindfulness, that's a good practice. And if you're really, I don't remember if you're the kind of person that it always feels driven to be doing things, that can be kind of unskillful. But if you're feeling like a wholesome, I love this practice, I want to do more, well, then start developing mindfulness in all of your activities, because then you'll always be doing something all the time. The practice never ends.
Great.
Yeah.
Awesome. And out of compassion, I think we should also answer then the other question from...
Okay.
We have time.
Yeah. If people push you to get into worldly stuff when you feel like detaching, then how can one explain them to give you some space?
Well, you can just say things like, no, thank you. Or say something like, oh, I think tonight I'd rather stay home and do some meditation. Or I have an increased appreciation for solitude these days. But start off by thanking them. Because usually when other people are pushing you into worldly things, it's because they want you to be happy and they think that will make you happy. So it's like, thank you, that's very kind. It's very kind of you. However, I want to do something else this time. And yeah, eventually you might just explain like, yeah, just as time goes by, I'm just getting more of an appreciation for contentment, more of an appreciation for peacefulness and a simple life, peaceful mind. And some people will just be like, okay, whatever, weirdo. And other people will be like, well, good for you. I'm happy that you're finding a way to be happy that works for you. And also what will tend to happen is that the more you practice contentment and serenity, then the more the people in your life will notice. They'll notice that you're doing something that's making you happier and more relaxed and more calm. So they'll appreciate that. Even if they don't really understand why you're behaving the way you're behaving, they'll recognize that it's having good results.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And that's the last. Did you have something else to add? Or is that
Oh yeah, no, just that in terms of detaching, if it's like detaching and like the practice is going well and you know, maybe you instead you don't want to go out to the club on the weekend, maybe you want to go to the monastery or something like that. Like if I would say like if you know, if you're detaching in a skillful way, then you'll naturally want to kind of move towards being with other people who are kind of on the same path, right? And then you can be with around skillful people doing skillful things. If it's detaching because of like depression or just wanting to be isolated, then maybe even on the path, you need other people. Even on the path, Kalyanamitas, good, virtuous friends are important.
Yeah. Okay. And that's the last of the questions. So I think we can go ahead and end it this time with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.